Today's lecture is going to cover the February Public Forum resolution. On balance, Turkey's membership is beneficial to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In today's lecture, I will cover three things. First of all, the basic terms of the resolution. Second, some important background related to the resolution. And then third, as always, the pro and the con arguments. Let's begin with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, of course, if you debated the September-October topic about Baltic security, you're familiar with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But if you didn't, I just want to review that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a military alliance between 30 European countries and North American countries, most importantly, at least in terms of from a security perspective, the United States. As you can see from the list of member countries, Turkey was one of the first countries to join NATO back in 1952. There are many different things to talk about regarding NATO, and in a minute we're going to talk about NATO's goals, because it is important to determine, looking at their goals, to determine if Turkey's membership in NATO is, in NATO's best interest. But one thing I want to remind everybody here is that a NATO decision is a decision of the collective will of all 30 member countries. So it is taken by consensus in NATO. So whatever a NATO agrees to, all the countries must agree to, including, of course, Turkey. Now, before we look at Turkey, let's just kind of talk about briefly what NATO's goals are. NATO's goals include maintaining the freedom and security of its members, to promote democratic values, that'll be important in our discussion, to cooperate on defense and security issues together to solve problems, and to prevent conflict. Also want to have the peaceful resolution of disputes. So you can think about this when you're on the pro, really even on the con, really both. These are the goals of NATO, right? So if an action is in the interest, right, or an action or an inclusion of a country in this case is in the interest of NATO, it would obviously have to be designed to help fill their goals. Now, Turkey is, of course, a country. It's also often referred to as Ankara, which is the capital of Turkey. The president is Recep Erdogan, which is often just referred to as Erdogan. He's been the quote-unquote president for 18 years. He is a devout Muslim, and it is a Muslim-majority country. I believe probably the only NATO member that has a Muslim-majority country. And his party is the AKP, the Islamic Justice and Development Party. Turkey does have a hostile relationship with the Kurds, which is the largest minority group in Turkey, and that plays out in some of the issues we'll discuss. Unlike other NATO members, Turkey does have serious conflicts with other NATO members, including France and Greece. France, for example, was trying to enforce an arms embargo against Libya, but Turkey was supporting one of the groups there and was trying to violate the arms embargo, and France intercepted one of the Turkish ships. There are conflicts with Greece because there are Turkish Cypriots living there. There's also conflicts over gas drilling. Both Greece and Turkey are trying to make claims to the same natural gas reserves. Turkey, unlike other NATO members, has some more direct ties with Russia. It does also provide, in the Mediterranean Sea, it's kind of involved in these resource conflicts. As I noted above, it has become more authoritarian. The same president, you can debate whether this president was legitimately or illegitimately elected for 17 years. Within Syria, when there's a big conflict in Syria a few years ago, they supported some of the groups that the U.S. opposed. Turkey also hosts approximately 50 tactical nuclear weapons, which is basically small battlefield nuclear weapons. I included this map here, and I hope you can see it well, because it does really show kind of the importance of where Turkey lies, right? Turkey is kind of right there, kind of to the south, all right, of the Black Sea, but it is kind of bordering on Bulgaria and Romania, which were when the Soviet Union was a single country that, and there were other kind of countries in the region, these countries are like kind of essentially part of the Eastern Bloc. These were former Russian allies, right? And countries including like Poland and, of course, you just debated about Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are actually part of Russia. And of course, right to the north of Turkey, across the Black Sea, you have the Ukraine, which you've been reading in the news or remember from debating the Baltic states topic. Russia currently has over 100,000 forces amassed on the border of the Ukraine and is arguably prepared and has threatened to invade the Ukraine. In 2004, they already took part of Crimea to gain a place in the Black Sea. So Turkey right now is currently very kind of involved in efforts to stop Russia from attacking the Ukraine, which I think will become a very important argument on this topic as to why, on balance, NATO, Turkey's membership is desirable. But these are important things to know about Turkey that are going to inform all the arguments in the debate. And I think, like I said, looking at the map and seeing the map where it is really where Turkey is really going to help you understand. Of course, I should also note that it borders Syria, Iraq, and Iran, because those are relevant to like lots of the terrorism debates. And I just talked about the conflict in Syria. So the few other things I'd note about the resolution is there really is no action or policy statement, right? It just asks whether or not Turkey's membership in NATO is in NATO's interest. Now, obviously, on these types of resolutions, you might debate about, what would it look like if Turkey was not part of NATO? That could become a question or not. You can debate that out, but there is no policy prescription. The second thing I'd really highlight, it is about NATO's interest, right? It's not about whether NATO is good or bad, right? Like, it's kind of almost obviously that an entity's survival is in its interest. So I don't really think we're debating about that. Now, you could look a little more particular beyond NATO, the member states, maybe the interests of the member states. Remember just back, what are its goals? To avoid war, right? To project military power, to promote democracy, to have cooperative decision-making. The third thing, there's a number one there. The third thing, though, is that the topic would probably be undebatable if Russia invades the Ukraine. Like, I can't imagine a world in which Russia invades the Ukraine, and it's not a good idea to have Turkey as part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. That'll probably make a little more sense to you as we go. And the fourth thing I'd say is that the resolution is really on balance pro. After reading maybe around 100 articles on the topic, I only found one that's the U.S. should, the U.S. should, I guess it was in that context, push to expel Turkey from NATO, or that Turkey really shouldn't be part of NATO. Even people who think that Turkey has caused a lot of problems in NATO, most of those people say it would still be on balance desirable if Turkey stays in the NATO alliance. It's something to think about, right, in the crossfire, pushing the con on, where is your evidence that, Turkey should not be in the NATO alliance? Now, let's go through some of the pro arguments. Now, generally speaking, I think that there's kind of a case, what is an ally? Does it belong in this security alliance? Right? NATO, as I said, is an alliance of Western countries and primarily designed to deter Russian aggression in Europe and kind of provide some regional security support. Well, it has kind of, participated in the deterrence of Russia since it entered the alliance back in 1952. It supported the U.S. mission, primarily the U.S. mission, but it was a NATO mission technically in Afghanistan. When NATO invoked Article 5 for collective defense when the U.S. was attacked on 9/11. Turkey supported that. It's been engaged in battles against the ISIS terrorist group. It's helped to stabilize Iraq. It does host NATO commands, like I said, including U.S. tactical nuclear weapons. It spends 2% or at least close to 2% on its GDP on defense, which is the expectation of all NATO members. And it has the second largest army kind of in NATO. So kind of regardless of the specifics and, some different contentions and scenarios we'll talk about, the case for remaining part of an alliance is pretty strong. It's been a pretty good member, right? A pretty good member of the family. It's made a significant contribution to the goals and, of the alliance. Well, it hasn't done everything kind of maybe we would hope. It has done a lot. in particular, as I mentioned earlier, and in the past, obviously, it performed an important role in deterring Russia generally in Europe. And in this case, it's kind of really doing a lot right now to try to resolve the Russia threat to the Ukraine. Most importantly, it's provided a lot of UAV, unarmed aerial vehicle, or drone technology to the Ukraine that would, a lot of evidence says, would really be essential in kind of to helping to offset the Russian air power advantage and provide surveillance. And that Turkey has a lot of experience in this area, and that Russia is actually afraid of their UAV capabilities, which are really kind of important to deterring the Russia. The second is that it provides naval support within the Black Sea. You could see the Black Sea there is like right under the Ukraine, like right above Turkey, right? If you were to go back to that map, which we'll talk about in a second. It's also been engaged in some effective diplomacy, or at least of diplomacy it's argued effective. So as we'll talk about, Turkey and some of the criticisms that are kind of made against Turkey being in the NATO alliance is that it has kind of maintained some ties and some security cooperation with Russia. Well, that kind of gives it some influence with Russia. And of course, it's part of NATO. So it kind of can potentially there use as broker and, kind of prevent a conflict. What's the impact to a conflict, right? Well, I mean, policy debaters and, even some PF debaters will say if Russia invades, escalate to a big nuclear war, the chances of that are probably limited. The U.S. is probably not going to retaliate militarily against the Russians. And in fact, I'd be shocked if they did. But the U.S. has kind of threatened to impose very severe economic sanctions on Russia, which could kind of completely isolate Russia and collapse its economy, severely undermine its economy, which could create other security problems, could destroy U.S.-Russian relations and cooperation in other areas. If all these, this huge conflict in the Ukraine, would obviously be very destabilizing in addition to just the deaths, produce probably 2 to 3 million refugees, which would make their way into Europe and destabilize Europe. And I think this is something that, the pro really be able to weigh, right? Like magnitude, all right? That's a huge war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, potentially millions of refugees. Time frame, this conflict is something that could develop at any time. Probability, the risk is high, right? The risk of conflict is growing. It's probably more probable than any other issue that it could be a prerequisite to resolving other security conflicts in the area. And of course, reversibility, if people die, they can't come back to life. But I think of all the weighing mechanisms, this is something that can be kind of persuasive, both because it's true and because, I think everybody is aware that Russia is currently a pretty big threat to the Ukraine at the moment. Of course, related to the Ukraine argument is the Black Sea, right? As I just mentioned, and I think, if you didn't kind of hear the first time when I did the little introduction, you didn't notice the significance of it. You can see how kind of close, right, Turkey is right there, right, to the Black Sea, to supporting, the Ukraine if it was potentially invaded, and just kind of deterring Russia generally in the Black Sea itself. How? Through some boats, kind of putting some additional, kind of just basic naval patrols in the Black Sea, through supporting surveillance, putting pressure on kind of Georgia and Armenia to kind of put a little pressure on Russia. How could it solve it? Expand naval forces, right? Cooperating Ukraine and Georgia, they're coordinating naval activities, and they also kind of control who has access to the Black Sea through the Turkish Straits. So you can think of the Black Sea as a separate argument. There's some different literature written about the Black Sea. It's obviously just about security there and how you don't want Russia to dominate the Black Sea. Obviously, some of those articles are going to discuss the Ukraine. I'm saying you could tease out a little bit of a separate argument, but in the context of the current world, it's probably really a lot, at least in the immediate term, right, about protecting kind of the interests of, the interests of the Ukraine, deterring the Ukraine. An additional argument is China. It's kind of hard to have a debate topic without debating about China anymore. What is the link? Well, for the U.S. to pivot to Asia, there's evidence that our other allies have to take on more and more of Europe's responsibilities, and that Turkey, and Europe, our responsibilities, I guess, in terms of defending Europe. And remember that Turkey has the second largest army. It's also a bridge to Asia. Look at where it's located. I mean, it's a small country relative to China, so it's probably not that essential to kind of the deterrence of China, but it's right there in the region. And just that we kind of need some strong, unity kind of within NATO in order to be able to effectively deter China. The other reason is that NATO hosts a key radar base that's important to the U.S. missile defense, and you can talk about the importance of U.S. missile defense in Europe. As I mentioned, they also host our tactical nuclear weapons. You can argue that Turkey hosting these tactical nuclear weapons is important to deter Russia because, look, Russia really does have a much larger army, right? Both in terms of kind of, I think even collectively than all the European countries put together, maybe close to it, definitely larger than what the U.S. has deployed there. So some people think we need the presence of these battlefield nuclear weapons to deter the Russians. Other people point out that like Turkey, being an Islamic country within NATO is actually very helpful because it can kind of work to deter what you might kind of consider to be like a class of civilization. Samuel Huntington wrote about this, about how there could be a clash of civilizations between the East and the West, right? And if you kind of keep these diametrically opposed to one another, that's even more likely. But if you could kind of split if you could have a Muslim country as part of a Western alliance, that could reduce that conflict. Turkey's also been important to reducing terrorism, right? In terms of using its own military capabilities. Again, it borders Iran and Iraq. Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Has been effective to counter terror operations in those areas, in those countries. It's taken actions, as I said, against ISIS and other groups that have been particularly threatening both to the people of Iraq and to the West, including the United States. It's also kind of helped with conflict resolution, right? Its own Turkey can use being part of NATO. That can help the conflict resolution mechanisms, can help diffuse its disputes with France, with Greece. So that's kind of very important. It is kind of arguably contributed. There's a debate, right, as to whether or not it's kind of fanned the flames of the conflict or Syria or helped kind of contribute to the resolution of it. But you can make arguments about that. And it's just kind of overall strengthened Syria's kind of credibility or soft power within. Turkey is also kind of arguably kind of maybe its existence kind of strengthens NATO. I don't know if that's enough to really kind of say, the arguments we talked about earlier, it saved NATO good or bad. I think NATO's continued existence is obviously in the best interest of NATO itself. But you could say that it strengthens NATO, which contributes to strengthening the overall post-World War II global international order. Now, again, as I said, the resolution doesn't really address whether or not, there's no policy prescription, right? But, teams will definitely debate, well, gee, what would it be like if Turkey was not part of NATO? If Turkey was no longer part of NATO, a couple things could happen, probably whether it left voluntarily on its own or whether or not it was pushed out by other countries that were happy with them. So the one thing is that Turkey currently hosts around 3 million refugees, most of which came from the Middle East. And if Turkey kind of didn't get kind of the benefits of the Western alliance, they might kind of no longer allow those refugees to stay in Turkey, which would push them all into Europe and be very destabilizing towards Europe. Turkey might also kind of proliferate, or in this context, what that means is to develop its own nuclear weapons, which could kind of create some of its own problems, including war in the region. There's just general debates about, obviously if Turkey got nuclear weapons, then other countries in the region might get nuclear weapons. Other countries would, kind of see that as a threat. In the second part of this lecture, we'll examine the con side. I think what the hard thing about the con side is that, Turkey has definitely created some problems for NATO. In a way, they're kind of NATO's problem child. Now, of course, many families have problem children, some of which do not even kind of bring a lot of benefits, but are part of the family and make contributions. And NATO has made, Turkey, as I said, has made contributions to this family. It's kind of like why it's a little bit difficult to simply get rid of them. But we do need to be calm in the debates. So let's kind of look through and make some arguments for why maybe Turkey should not continue to be in NATO. The first argument, as I said, is just simply that Turkey doesn't belong. That it's not a democratic country, arguably. You can debate this. The first argument is just simply that Turkey doesn't belong in NATO. And this goes back to thinking about what are the goals and values of NATO, right? Well, the first is to promote, or one of the first is to promote democracy. There's a lot of criticisms of Turkey that Turkey is no longer democratic and it doesn't protect human rights. If that's the case, then it probably doesn't belong in a Western military alliance that's dedicated to those two ideas. Second of all, it does have conflict with other NATO members, right, such as France and Greece. And if those are, the point of the alliance is a group of countries that are unified, not those that have military conflicts with each other. Of course, conflicts are going to rise between countries. But here we haven't had a war, but we've kind of had some significant military clashes. The third is that it doesn't really have a very strong market economy, which kind of goes a bit with the democracy argument that these are the type of economies that NATO wants to protect. And it kind of has its own deals with Russia, right? That, is definitely probably not in the interest of the NATO alliance. So when you kind of, you're making kind of friends with the alliance's enemy is not really the best position to be in. Now, that is kind of a broad kind of a criticism of why allowing them to continue. What are kind of some of the practical consequences? Well, you can kind of make an argument that it undermines NATO cohesion, right? That Turkey is fighting with its own members, as I've mentioned many times. It has ties to Russia, and is willing to kind of use those ties for its own kind of its own gains, its own needs. Maybe it thinks at any given time that Russia can provide more for its own security, and in particular ways. In that case, it'll build its relationship with Russia. That's going to undermine NATO cohesion. It's going to back Azerbaijan, which is interesting, right? I just kind of said about how Turkey is kind of in alignment or kind of tries to make friends with Russia on particular issues, but it's also been backing Azerbaijan in its conflict with Armenia, and Russia backs Armenia. So some people say that this could be a way that indirectly the NATO gets drawn into a war, with Russia. Or it could suck the U.S. into some kind of war with kind of some of the allies within NATO. There's an argument that Turkey is anti-Western and is just kind of in ideals and popular support, that Erdogan builds popular support by being opposed to the West. And that Turkey has blocked kind of new partners from joining NATO, such as Israel and the United Arab Emirates. As I kind of talked about at the beginning of the lecture, NATO decision-making is based on consensus. And if any country kind of vetoes an action, it can't happen. So even if all the other countries want the UAE and they want Israel in the alliance, if Turkey objects, which they have, then they can't get in the alliance. The democratic values argument, we kind of talked about before, that you can look in a way and say, well, that goes with kind of just do they belong? You could also make an argument, it's a weak argument, but you can make an argument that kind of undermines NATO's ability to promote democracy and just kind of the general democracy promotion arguments. In terms of another, kind of moving kind of beyond, we have the kind of the NATO cohesion arguments, weakening NATO. It could also undermine NATO's ability to protect the Baltics. And obviously this is and there are obviously three countries, if you remember from the September-October topic, that are NATO members, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania. There was a security plan that NATO had developed to increase the protection of the Baltic states, which Turkey had vetoed. Turkey also vetoed, interesting, right, Belarus, right? Belarus has kind of become more of arguably a dictatorship, that it's aligned with Russia. And the Belarus forced this landing of a civilian airliner to detain and really torture a human rights activist. and they wanted to, the NATO, wanted to put a lot of pressure on Russia related to this. European countries wanted to sanction. They wanted to kind of have some more support to kind of challenge Belarus, and Turkey vetoed this, right? So that could kind of undermine, and Belarus is right there by the Baltic countries, and is kind of threatening the Baltic countries kind of a little bit on the behalf of Russia. So this could kind of undermine NATO's ability to deter Russian aggression against the Baltics, and of course you have all your impacts to that from the first topic. Then you also kind of have issues kind of related, to Russia itself. That they are cooperating with Russia, as I've talked about, and they've even purchased some air defense weapon systems from Russia, and they made the United States and other leading Western powers, leading countries within NATO, expressed a lot of concerns about this because they thought it would see that Russia had, would enable Russia to kind of see into the technology behind some of NATO's defense systems. In terms of China, we talked about how on the pro they might kind of help deter China, but also the Turkey has been deporting some Uyghurs, which kind of ended up back in China. And of course, there's a lot of media criticism of China. China denies that there are a lot of human rights abuses of the Uyghurs in China. They're also developing commercial ties with China, which undermine kind of efforts to contain China economically. So there's kind of arguments there on both sides of the debate. In terms of the terrorism debate, again, we talked about some pro arguments about how the alliance, Turkey's inclusion in the alliance can strengthen counterterrorism cooperation. But one group that the United States wants to cooperate with, and other leading countries want to cooperate, is they want to cooperate with the Kurds against terrorist groups like ISIS. But Turkey, right, kind of doesn't like the Kurds, right? They have a oppositional relationship with this minority group, and kind of undermines the efforts of Western powers to cooperate with the Turks. And of course, some people say that, with the Kurds, and of course, some people say that the Turkish government is opposing the human rights and threatening the human rights of the Kurdish people, which, if you look back to it, one of the goals of the NATO alliance is to protect democracy and human rights. So you can make an argument there as well. As I'll conclude, it is tough. Like I said, it is tough to be the con. I've outlined kind of about as many arguments as I've been able to find in the literature and tried to be creative here and there. But, sometimes I think, going into it, it's like a little bit, if you're the underdog, you want to kind of just think through it more and think about how it is you're going to compensate. This lecture was recorded on July 2nd, one day after I started researching the topic. So I think that you may be able to find some additional arguments and ideas for the con, and I will kind of be working on that as well.